Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce this distinguished panel that has been organized by Professor Tae-Hong Park here at Tulane University, and it's we owe a debt of gratitude to him for organizing this, and to the chair of his department, Professor Barbara Jaswinski, and to Professor Park's graduate students who have done so much to facilitate the program today. And before I introduce our panelists, I want to remind them that because this is being recorded both in picture and in sound, that they should use their microphones, even though I'm sure all of you out there can hear us without them. The people who have agreed to participate in this panel are the people who are responsible for the almost inevitable, one could say, link between computers and music over the last 50 years. Not all of them have worked that long in the field, but at least one has. And these are the people who made possible both the hardware for computer music instruments, who designed computers themselves, who designed the software, who worked with students who did the same thing at their various institutions, and with companies around the world that manufactured both instruments and systems for the digital manipulation of sound and music. And it seemed appropriate that for a group of this kind who have been involved since the very beginning and who are responsible really for the connection between computers and music that we all know today, that we should pose a question. And the question is of some both historical import and contemporary value. And that is, 40 years ago, in 1967, what did you think the future of computers and music would be? And then again, today, looking forward 40 years, in 2007, what do you think the relationship between computers and music will be? And so to address these issues, from my left to right is Jon Chowning, Max Mathews, Maureen Chowning, F. Richard Moore, and Julius Smith. And we have, they didn't even know this question probably until they got up here today, but from their vast experience over a millennium, I think they're probably prepared to answer. So why don't we start with you at that end, Julius, and talk about how it was when in '67 and how you think it's going to be starting in 2007.
Okay, well, in 1967, I was in the 8th grade, and I had not
67.
touched my first computer. I was, that would come in 1971 when I went to Rice. So, so the first part of the question is quite easy for me. There was no relation, in my mind at least. But I was seriously interested in how things worked. I was a guitar player, and I did have little effects boxes and amplifiers, and I was very interested in what was going on there. And I think it is why I became an electrical engineer devoted to music as an application area. So the origins of that really were present in 1967. And I envisioned the computer as a tool in the recording studio first and foremost. I did not envision the degree to which it would become part of everything, that you would have processors in every little device. That's just something I never thought of. And so it's hard to predict the future that far out. Today, I can't predict 40 years either, but certain things are clear. Computers will be everywhere. There will be wireless computers. I'm imagining they might be powered by sunlight or just even motion or body temperature. I mean, we'll eventually get free, I think, of power lines. That's the one thing that isn't wireless right now is power. So it'll be nice when really they're in the fabric of everything, doing what we want, and so the music applications open up from there. So I think that's a start.
Dick?
1967 was the year when I worked my first day at Bell Labs. It was May Day, and I've been in trouble ever since. May Day, May 1st, 1967, I went to Bell Labs to work primarily because I heard a talk given by a visionary about the possible uses of computers in music. The visionary is sitting 3 seats to my left. It was Max Mathews that I heard speak at the University of Illinois. And I was already there for the purpose of studying computer music. I had taught myself to program by then. I was a graduate music composition and theory student, but I was there to study with Lajaran Hiller and the other people at the University of Illinois, and those, of course, were very early days of computing. That's when mice were mice and men were men and women were women, and computers would fill this room. They were enormous, they were expensive. I could not possibly imagine what they've become in the sense of becoming so ubiquitous as they are today. But one thing seemed like a possibility to me in 1967, or it rapidly became one, and that was that somehow computers represented the ability to do absolutely anything you could do with sound. The idea that a computer basically was a way to control a loudspeaker that was something I learned really from Max, I think, in completely arbitrary and programmable ways, meant that ultimately you could produce any sound that could come from a loudspeaker, certainly, with a computer, and you could probably study sounds beyond that and even imagine what those might be. So that's where I started off with no idea of where it was going to go, and what I knew least about was not so much the potential, but not the potential of the idea of controlling sound in this way, but the idea of what technology would become, what computer technology would become. So if I turn to the other side of the question now and talk about today, I have to say I've learned my lesson, which is 40 years later, I've learned that in 40 years, whatever technology will be, you and I probably wouldn't even recognize it. I think Arthur Clarke has a famous saying about that. Any technology that's sufficiently advanced looks like magic. So I tend to ally myself in my thinking with people like Ray Kurzweil and others who most people regard as lunatics, and suspect that there will be the possibility, for example, that computers are made of what? They're made of the important parts are made of silicon and things like that, the parts that do the actual computing. Now, what is silicon? Well, you can find silicon inside a computer, or if you smash up a computer thoroughly, you basically make sand. It's basically dust. So this means that we have the prospect of intelligent dust on our hands that we can all simply breathe, and as a result of this, they call it nanotechnology, folks. As a result of this kind of intervention in the lives of everybody, what is going to happen to people in their relationships to machines is something that will change not just quantitatively. That is, we won't just get better mice and faster keyboards and more resolved displays with three-dimensional sound and that sort of thing, but our entire relationship with technology will change, and probably in the direction of making it completely transparent to us as we use it, because that's the way it's become over the last 40 years. Why should that trend stop?
Great. Maureen?
Yes. In '67, I was still in high school, and I went to college shortly after that. And I realized that I loved music so much, and I loved the music of the well-known dead composers like Mozart and Liszt and Schubert and Schumann. And I thought one day that I would love to be able to work with live composers so that I could sort of help them to create the ideas that they had and the fulfillment of the performances of their pieces. I was always fascinated with the idea of sound in space. Maybe it was the coming of 2001 film. That idea that you can have sound sort of hover in a space, in and out of time, and to be able to stretch the voice as far as it can go from a whisper in a way, especially with microphones, so that you could actually feel as if you were inside experiencing my inner thoughts as I sang them or whispered them. Most of all, I just have an incredible respect for the people who create this music and those who assist in creating devices to fulfill some of these dreams that composers have, and including their own.
The question should be rephrased for our next panelist, because for him, the connection between computers and music is 50 years old, not 40 years old. Max?
Well, John, I was thinking of an answer that would be appropriate in 1967. That was really the completion of what I consider the most important contributions that I've made to computer music, i.e. a Music 5 program was finished at that time. What did Music 5 do that my previous programs did not do? Well, the most important thing was that it was made up of what I called unit generators, and these were building blocks that I could give to the musician to construct the instruments and the timbres that he wanted to use in his composition. It also had a reasonable score in it for expressing the notes that he wanted to play on these instruments that he would make. Now, before that time, I had made some timbres and had some limited possibilities for changing them, but it was up to me to decide what timbres I would provide facilities for making, and I was not up to that job, and the musicians that tried my timbres had lots of requests for different timbres and improvements and this and that. So it seemed to me the only solution to this was to give the musician the tools with which he could make his own instruments. And I think I did that in Music 5. And there have been many subsequent programs that have also had these tools. Originally, they were what I call command line tools, where you describe in letters and words the instrument, and eventually people made GUIs out of them so that you could draw the instruments on a computer screen, and that's very popular. But the basic things were in Music 5 at that time. Now, the other thing that Music 5 had that was a breakthrough was that it was written in a compiler language. In those days, Fortran was, well, the only appropriate compiler for a highly technical program like a music synthesis program. So Music 5 was written in Fortran, and that meant that as each new generation of computers came along, you did not have to rewrite the Music 5 program. You could just recompile it. And so that made it possible for the program to keep up with the changes in computers, which, as you know, have accelerated and gotten faster and faster. And now almost all the programs are written in a higher level language. I think the language C is probably the one that I know best, and C Sound is a successor to Music 5 and has many of the unit generators in it that were in Music 5, and of course has a lot of new music generators. So that is my outlook in 1967. Now, why did I do all this? Well, I had a number of motivations. One was that I always loved and still love to play the violin, and I'm a very limited violinist, limited player. So I wanted to make an instrument that wouldn't require the physical dexterity to make music. And I thought the computer would be that instrument. I also felt that many composers wrote pieces for orchestras, and they might have to wait for years to hear their music, and that it would be nice if they could at least hear what I'm now calling a cartoon of their music synthesized on a computer, which would perhaps aid them in the process of composing music for an orchestra if they were headed for an orchestra. And I think that is turning out to be a useful thing. I heard a cartoon, did I not, John, of some of your music that you had in MIDI for this last piece, Proceed Eyes?
That's right.
And so those were, and of course the other factor was here was something that hadn't been done, and it was irresistible not to try to do it. Now, what about the future of music? Well, talking about the future is both easy and impossible. And the people who do that the best today are the people who write weather reports. And they can always be correct. They simply say, tomorrow the probability of rain will be 50%. And it always turns out it either rains or doesn't rain tomorrow. So I can speculate without concern. Now, at the beginning, computers were incredibly slow and incredibly expensive. And so to get a halfway decent timbre out of a computer, you had to perhaps spend a minute or 2 minutes making 1 second of sound. And this meant that you could run the computer all night and listen to the composition the next day, but you could not put the computer on the stage and play it, and you could not play it like you would a normal musical instrument where you can feel the music and change the way you're playing to make the music what you want. Well, now that is absolutely no longer true. Both Jon Chowning and I have calculated how much more powerful computers are today than they were in the beginning. I get my numbers in terms of estimates of computer power, and I estimated that a present-day laptop computer is that I got a few years ago, was 30,000 times more powerful than the IBM 7090 that I first worked on. Probably 50,000 is a more relevant thing. Now, as I said, the time scale of early music tended that the composers dealt with tended to be about 100 to 1, i.e. it took the computer 100 times as much time to make a portion of sound as the sound it took itself. So if we remove this factor of 100 from this estimate of 30,000, divide it, we still get that computers could make 300 sets of interesting sounds, 300 instruments in real time. And this would be a simple laptop computer that is perfectly appropriate to have on the stage during a performance. Well, that a single computer could be a whole orchestra full of instruments, or you could have a laptop orchestra with a dozen computers that would be far beyond the financial and physical capabilities of putting together real instruments for that purpose. So the point about this is that computing power no longer is a limit to the music that can come out of computers. If it's not a limit, what is the limit? What are the areas to conquest in the future to really make digital music better and more powerful, more lovable? At the beginning, the sounds that I got out of a computer were absolutely terrible. Composers, real musicians, came along like Jean-Claude Risset and Jon Chowning that did get better sounds out. I consoled myself at the beginning, kept on working, motivated myself, with a mathematical theorem that I attributed to Claude Shannon, although actually the 17th century mathematicians really knew this theorem, so-called sampling theorem. And it says that any sound the human ear can hear can be generated from a sequence of digital samples, of the right samples. And that is, I think and still believe, is a true theorem, but I've now added a corollary to this theorem. And that corollary says that in the class of any sound, any timbre, almost all the timbres that you can create easily are either uninteresting or disagreeable. Primarily timbres are made of noises, or perhaps even dangerous. These are timbres that are played too loudly over loudspeakers, and that it is very difficult to make sounds that are interesting and exciting and beautiful and that we want to hear. This is sort of an eternal problem, and I think this problem is the area for conquest in the next era of musical development. Now, where will we find out what people want to hear? And as I started to say, this is no longer a technical limitation of the computer. We can really make any sound. The area that we don't understand is inside our heads. What are the sounds that come in our ear, and what are the sounds that when we hear them we get excited? And not just the timbres, but the timbres and the organization of these timbres and the structure of the piece that we're hearing. Why do we think something is beautiful? Why do we think something else is not? So I think this now requires a lot more work on both the low-level psychology and physiology of sound and music perception by the human ear, and the higher order interpretation of these sounds by the musical cortex and the higher levels of the human brain. Now, this is an area that used to belong very much exclusively to experimental psychologists. And the techniques, perhaps, for studying this still are the techniques that the psychologists have worked out. But even if a psychologist learns something, he will never make a composition out of it, because most psychologists are not composers. So we have the question of either teaching psychologists how to be composers, or teaching composers how to understand this very complex theory that the scientific people are doing. Well, my personal opinion is that being an exciting composer is a completely unknown talent that is a gift of God or something in the person, and it's impossible to teach anyone who is not a natural composer and wants to be a composer how to be a composer, so that we cannot teach engineers like me or psychologists to be composers. So the alternative is to teach composers more about psychology. And this is another load to put on the composer. But in addition to learning to program in C, but I think that will be where we will have to go. And this will be a very interesting field, and this is a field that universities can work in, and this is a field that many new things will be found, and it's almost an inexhaustible source of new wealth, musical wealth coming out, and this is where I hope the direction of music will go.
Thank you, Max. John?
Well, 1967, I met Max 4 years before, and to speak to his point about the representation, and actually Music 4 was also a modular form of his program. Music 5 was much the same.
Music 3 was modular.
Music 3.
Music 5 was written in Fortran.
Written in Fortran, that's right. And Music 4 was the one with which I had my first encounter. And I must say that of the various imaginable representations of making music with computers, Max's particular one made this medium accessible to those of us whose background was distant from technology and sciences. So the representation allowed me to engage in this field and be reasonably effective in a very short period of time. And for that, I thank Max forever. It's hard to imagine what life would be like were it not for the paper that he wrote about his work in Science and published in November 1963, which I read shortly after, and that's what got me into this field. Now, in 1967, well, that was a good year. December 18th, 1967, on a visit to Bell Labs, perhaps my third, at which time Jean-Claude Risset was working with Max. I didn't meet Dick at that time, although I may have, and neither of us remember. I visited Max and showed him showed Max and Jean-Claude Risset and Pierre Ruiz some examples of kind of funny vibrato that I had made about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So it could be, this could be the 40th anniversary today, I don't know. And these examples were of what results when one extends vibrato rates and deviation beyond the normal rates that we experience in music performance, on the order of 5 to 7 times per second and plus or minus a few percentage of the frequency. And of course that eventually became known as frequency modulation synthesis. And I knew at that time that I had done these experiments that this was an idea that had legs. Otherwise, I would not have taken them and shown them to my friends at Bell Labs. It took some years for this idea to find some broad application. In fact, it took about 16 years. I think it was 1983 when the first widely used synthesizer was produced by Yamaha, and that was the DX7. But this was a breakthrough that was based upon work that had been prepared in a way by Max and Jean-Claude Risset at Bell Labs beginning in 1964 in their analysis and synthesis of complex tones, modeling both stringed instruments and brass instruments. The insight came particularly from Jean-Claude and Max's work on the simulation of brass tones, where they had used an early analytical procedure, a program, to look at the pitch periods of a trumpet tone through its attack portion, discovered that the centroid of the spectrum shifted to the higher frequencies as the overall intensity increased in the 30 or 40 milliseconds of a typical trumpet attack. When I showed Max and Jean-Claude this work that I had done with vibrato, Jean-Claude explained to me this work that they had done at Bell Labs on the analysis and resynthesis of trumpet tones. And it was maybe in '71 that I remembered this and had this idea, well, if I couple the modulation index and the amplitude envelopes to the same function shape, then I would achieve the same thing. And that was kind of a breakthrough which resulted finally in the interest in Yamaha in exploiting this technique. Brass tones had been particularly difficult to synthesize by known synthesis methods, mostly analog. So this success that Jean-Claude and Max had realized at Bell Labs, and then I with quite a different technology or synthesis technique, a few years later, was an important moment I think in the evolution of computer music in those early years. When I think of the future, I believe that we, as my colleagues here, it's very difficult to predict what will be. That is, technology is always surprising. I did a calculation a little bit different than the one that Max did, showing the enormous increase in power cost ratios. The computer that he first used and that I first used, the IBM 7094, had about 150,000 bytes of memory, and a byte of memory in those days cost about $19.67, something like that. That is, if we base the cost of memory, divide the cost of the computer, just using the memory as a kind of a basis of comparison. So the typical laptop, my Apple Mac Pro, has 3 gigabytes, and that's about 83 cents times 10 to the minus 6 cents per byte. So if we extend one forward and the other back, the IBM 7090 based upon memory would be worth today about 12 cents. And the Mac Pro with 3 gigabytes in 1967 would have been worth, hold your chairs, $59 billion. So that's extraordinary, and I don't open up my laptop once, ever, without thinking of what it was like in those early days with key punch cards and those long waits. But there was a very great value that in some of those waits because we paid a lot of attention to the detail, a lot of attention to getting it right, because the cost of getting it wrong was so enormous. Imagine waiting 24 hours for 10 seconds of this next piece, and what you get back is a little printout from the computer operator which tells you that the computer failed because of an error, a missing comma, or whatever. So we became very, very attentive to the details of that which we were about. And with running a real-time program like MaxMSP or whatever, I maintained those habits of looking with care and forgetting the fact that I could make these changes in real time rapidly and make a decision quickly based upon my ear, but try and understand what it is I'm doing, just as I had to do in those years. So I think that's something that we have maybe lost in this era of rapid, unfettered computation, is remembering that we still have to understand the detail. I think one of the things that has to do with our future that is very important is that we're impoverished in our field in the sense that a young composer doesn't have the equivalent to scores to which he or she can go, open up and look at the way things were done by a composer and relate that to the auditory result. Most of us who studied composition learned a lot from our teachers, but most of us who studied composition learned probably mostly from looking at other scores, that is the scores of masters. And we don't have that equivalent. There's no easy way in our field to look at the scores of masters, and I think that should change. I think those of us who have worked these years in this field should open up the internal workings of what we did, and so that becomes available from which people, another generation can learn and build upon. And there's some who are doing that. I think Miller Puckett at UCSD has recreated some of the older works, for example, Studi 2 by Stockhausen, if you want to know how that works. That is now fully transparent and available to anyone who cares. In the recent publication of CMJ, we, after long work, 4 researchers, composers have reconstructed Stria, a piece that I wrote 30 years ago. So that now, with a CD-ROM, everything that's known about Stria, including my original program and the original sound files, the reconstructed program, the reconstructed sound files are all available to anyone who would like to look at them. I wish there were many more examples of this sort, because I think the future of this medium depends upon that information becoming available to everyone, just as a Mozart score or a Strauss score or a Boulez score is available to anyone who cares. The other thing about the future, and with this I'll end my contribution, I don't know what the technology will look like, but I'm pretty sure that in 50 years we will still have 10 fingers and about the same size lungs, lip formations, etc. And these, coupled with the instruments that we know, with which we engage and spend, if one is really good, thousands and thousands of hours of practice in order to master and in order to produce music. Those things aren't going to change, I believe. It's not a question of economy. We play music because we love to play, not because there aren't more efficient ways to do it or to produce it. And what I think will happen in the relationship of computer music and performance is what is already happening. That is, the engagement with performance and computation, which Max envisioned many, many years ago, beginning with a teletype key, a radio baton, which I believe of all the controllers is still maybe the most powerful and convincing, because it's simple, it's complex in potential, and everyone can do it. That is, everyone can do it, some better than others, but everyone can tap a finger or tap a foot, and that is kind of the base level of Max's baton. It can also be used by virtuoso performers, as Andy Schloss has demonstrated as a real percussionist. It also can be used by singers, as Maureen has demonstrated with Max many times. So this kind of controller will, with new possibilities of computation, I think will be enhanced. And that engagement with performance and performers, extending the virtuoso technique that is a part of every instrumental performance, I find to be probably the most engaging and promising aspect of the future. Musical performance is enhanced by its engagement with computers, I believe. And that is what we see as this world of real-time synthesis, real-time processing advances, is more and more performance.
Well, let me first ask if any of our panelists have something they want to address to another. A comment or question? Having done that, let me ask those of you out there if you have questions you'd like to address to any of the panelists. Yes, sir.
I have a question. It's for pretty much the entire panel. Do any of you see...
Should we use the microphone? Because...
Okay, sorry about that. Do any of you see anything past the digital medium? Like any other way to deliver music, anything, just beyond that?
What are you referring to when you say digital medium?
Well, pretty much all of you were the the parents of the digital age, MIDI, digital music, just that delivery, that medium of music. And I was just kind of curious if you see anything beyond that, something more organic or analog, if you will.
Sure. That's what I was referring to when I was talking about intelligent dust. I think that the instruments that we'll be playing in the sense that we play instruments now, and I think the kind that both Max and Jon have talked very specifically about, will become increasingly virtual. So, you know, what we see today is kids performing with, my daughter does this all the time, it's called air band, you know, where everybody stands up and performs and does the performance gestures without actually playing the music. Now, this is a great relief of responsibility, but imagine being able to actually play the music that way. That is, to have a virtual guitar that doesn't exist except for the fact that you can see it and anybody else who you would like to see it is able to see it, but it's completely virtual in the sense that there's no guitar there. And so it's not necessarily limited by your physiology or physiological expertise in the traditional musical performance sense, but it is one that can respond according to ways that either you can imagine or program or control or insert somehow into that, so that that becomes your guitar that you play your way, and it may be something that somebody else would design in a completely different way. And this whole possibility for virtual instruments that essentially work directly from a kind of neurophysiological, you know, input is something that I think is not at all without the realm of possibility based on what we know today. And I'm not speaking particularly speculatively here.
I just wanted to add something myself to what Max Mathews said. It deals with the organic question. I think computers may be useful for the analysis of data. That is, particularly the data which we call music, which is stored in our brains, all the music we've ever heard. And then another data bank of all the music that exists. And that the analysis of our musical preferences, what we find beautiful and what we like to hear, will be the subject of analysis of computers, which will then enable us to hear the music that we consider the most beautiful and satisfying. It will have nothing to do with digital, because you can't play it with your digits.
Along the same line, I had envisioned, if you will, a kind of, everyone would have access. If you could just imagine each of us in our own room has a little chair, one of these hanging chairs that you can sit in. They look like a pod, sort of. You could sit in there, and with either having a little pad with your hands or just regions that you can move your hands in, and you could have your own personal sounds that you particularly love. That sort of, it's almost like a music therapy, if you will, that you could you could center yourself in a way. And also that could involve lights as well. I mean, it's kind of futuristic, but you could have your own sound light pod in a way. Pamela Z, I don't know, you're probably familiar with some of her work, has already embarked on that using various, at least physical, at the physical level now, but they respond to biofeedback, and she's developed gestures that she uses particularly and brings out these exquisitely beautiful timbres.
Well, we've had a digital revolution, not just in music and art form, but in communication of almost any material, in that today, if you talk over the telephone even to a neighbor, probably your voice gets digitized in the transmission before it's reconverted to an analog signal, so his ear, who is an analog device, can hear it. The digits are much, much more robust for either storing information or transmitting information than analog signals. So today, we don't have a single telephone system for the entire country. In the 1950s, when we didn't have any digital communication, we did have to have one system because the analog signals, especially for long distance transmission, were just completely fragile, and unless you had one company doing everything exactly the same and exactly right, you couldn't understand what the guy in Chicago was saying when he called New Orleans. And nowadays, if you convert the original signals to numbers, then you can hand these numbers off to myriads of different companies, and the error correcting and error robustness, the robustness of the digits are so good that when you hear it anywhere in the universe, you'll be able to understand it. So that's a very practical reason for digitizing things, from images, DVDs, to music, to speech, to books or printed materials and all that. I guess I have a question to you. There are a group of very good musicians, I think, who only want to hear music in a concert hall. Are you one of those?
No, I'm not.
Mm-hmm. I'm not either. I learned to appreciate music by listening to records, 78 RPM shellac records at the beginning, and then when I was about 20, the vinyl records came through. And so my pleasure center really lights up brighter and more often listening to recorded media than it does sitting in a expensive, often uncomfortably seated concert hall with an orchestra and an audience coughing and a few other things. But I think some of the conductors I've worked with, like Pierre Boulez, he did use records actually to prepare a new piece, but I don't think really thought it was music until he was standing in front of the orchestra. So in essence, I think that except for what are becoming increasingly smaller proportion of the amount of music that's heard by people, that digits and numbers for storing and communicating the sounds are here to stay.
Is there another question?
Hello, everybody. It's kind of like being at a Star Trek convention and getting to ask all the cast members these long-awaited questions. I really have three of them, but I'll start, first of all, Dr. Chowning is certainly the one whose career I followed the most, and I credit you, or I should say blame you, for many thousands of hours of my time spent programming the DX7 in the last 20 years. And I certainly agree with Max's assessment that 99% of the timbres you come up with are no good. I think I found them all single-handedly.
There's more, don't worry.
I haven't given up yet. My question for you is, well, really, I almost forgot the first question, sorry. When you first started with FM synthesis, one of your primary goals was emulating vocal synthesis. How do you think the state of the art is today, and do you still dabble in that?
Well, first let me say that I too was frustrated with the DX7, and I think we were all happy when people like David Ziccarelli produced a program that would allow us edit the parameters on a computer. That was a big improvement. The synthesis of the voice sounds was a little bit later. That was in '69. Let me say that my own feeling about the richness of this whole medium and independent of the synthesis techniques has to do with our better understanding of the physical instruments that we all know and love. They're the best of all jumping off points to this world of which Max speaks, which is a world of a kind of sonic coupling with the ear as the ear seems to want to select. And I think physical modeling is one of the most exciting fields, and maybe we ought to ask Julius, because Julius has spent his professional life thinking about this issue. And I would agree that with Dick that the virtual world of musical instruments is a very compelling one, as long as it preserves the kind of force feedback conditions that good players need in order to perform, because they do need that kind of haptic display, as they called it, which, when coupled with powerful physical modeling, which I guess becomes ever richer in its potential because of the computational depth that we have at hand, I would pass this question directly to Julius, if I might.
Well, I could also add to the previous question on this topic, because a big part of what's happening now is virtual everything. So, in the case of the previous question, virtual analog is a big trend nowadays. There are a lot of people, coming up with the ways to really digitize correctly, classic works of art in the analog realm, and it still goes on today. I have 2 or 3 PhD students in that area right now. How do you digitize a tube really right, and so it passes the black curtain test. And once it passes the black curtain test, then you can just stop listening to all the noise. You'll still hear a lot of people saying, "Oh no, I've got to have a tube." But once it passes the black curtain test, then it really is simulated, and a lot of things can really be simulated even at ordinary audio sampling rates. Things that are highly nonlinear, like tubes, require a very high sampling rate. So to make digital really sound analog, if you're simulating deeply an intrinsically nonlinear device, at least if the valued characteristics are nonlinear, then you do really need to oversample, and you have to invest in filtering. The nonlinearities need to be broken down so that they're in stages and you can filter them down. You basically have to guard against aliasing. Analog is basically digital with an infinite sampling rate and a lot of noise and a lot of unpredictability. So digital can do everything it needs to do, but we still don't know how to do everything. So virtual analog still goes on. There are still new plugins coming out for new valued studio gear that was analog, great circuit designs. There's a repertoire around it. Recording engineers really know how to operate that equipment, and they're simulating them exactly right, even down to the response of the VU meter. The same time constants on the meter, and the panels look exactly right, and there's no noise, there's no flakiness. Everything is exactly the way you left it. Your patches can be preloaded as presets exactly right. No matter how much time you put into it, it's saved. So the digital virtualification is a good thing. And it's going on in musical instruments. So virtual acoustic instruments is where I've done quite a bit of research, and I think that's going to keep getting better and better. We can really simulate strings well. And we can simulate air columns to a pretty good extent, especially in linear modes. But when you get into aeroacoustic jets, switching air jets in a flute, those are tough. Those are tough problems, and I don't think we really know the right models that will be indistinguishable, that will pass the black curtain test, not only for the listener but for the player. And that's where you get a real acid test. It's got to respond exactly right to the player, and it's the player who judges whether the simulation is really adequate.
Well, it does make you wonder what they'll be emulating in 40 years. Will they remember what VU meters and tubes were, or even musical instruments? You wonder.
These are classics, classics. I mean, why are we still trying to simulate things that are 40 years old? I think we'll have virtual pianos, and there's a long history of musical instrument development. It takes centuries to develop, some instruments, and we're not going to throw that away lightly. We're going to have them in our orchestra, and the composers can choose whether to use them or not, but we should have them all. They should all be in the library. And who knows where culture will evolve and what will be used. I can't predict that at all, but I can predict we're going to have them all.
Well, both your answers lead me right to the second question, if I may, which is, do you feel like the ubiquity of computers today and the lower cost of access, as you might put it, has in any way, or possibly will in any way, trivialize musicianship in general, where anybody today can be a musician? And soon we might not even have to own an instrument?
Well, you'll have to own something. You don't have to necessarily own a traditional instrument. Now, I guess I should augment a little bit of what I said before by remarking that there are two great ways, or two main ways, in which all of the kind of technological developments that all of us have worked on and others have worked on have been applied. One is what I would call the replacement way, where if somebody invents a better mousetrap, the assumption is that it's going to replace the old, less good mousetrap, and therefore everybody will be using the quote-unquote better one. Now, I think there has been a certain amount of replacement that's gone on, and if we look at the piano business, for example, we see that every major piano manufacturer in the world, except for Bösendorfer, has a digital piano, and Bösendorfer may be coming along one of these days, but everybody's making digital pianos these days. Why? It's because computers are the only thing in the world getting cheaper. Otherwise, a piano is a handmade device, like a violin. And it's expensive. It's getting more expensive because people are getting more expensive. That's just the way of the world. So most of the motivation behind substituting musical technology for older musical technology has all been economic. It's not been because it sounds better or it works better or there's something inherently more wonderful about it. That's the part of music technology which has never, ever interested me. There is, however, the other part, which is the augmentative part of it, which is what can we do using computers and other kinds of technological approaches that we couldn't do without that. Now that, to me, seems to be a matter of exploration. And of course, 99.9% of the places that you go are not interesting places, but it's that 1 in 1,000 places that you arrive at where you really want to get out your camera phone quick and record this, because this is something really special, because you realize that there is a place that you've reached through whatever means you've gotten there that you could not have reached in any other way than the way you got there. And that's always been the part of digital music and music technology that I have always found the most interesting.
And I'll ask my third question, and would like to pay honor today to Dr. Bob Moog, who passed away last year, your analog counterpart, you might say. And that is to ask the panelists, what's your latest pet project? I'd really like to hear what's going on. And thank you.
Thanks for your great questions. What's our order, Mr.
You're starting.
I'm lead batter. It means I don't bat very high, but I can usually get on base. That's kind of how the lead batter has to. Well, my pet project right now is implementation of things. I see my career as having 4 stages. First stage is learn. Just scoop up all knowledge that might be relevant to music technology. Second stage is, well, let's do something with that knowledge. Let's try to make an impact in the research world. So it's sort of the research phase. And then the third phase is, well, let's write it all. Let's document this stuff. Let's just write everything up. And so I've written 4 books and then some. And so now I'm on to the really most interesting phase of all, which is really using it. And so I'm implementing things. So I'm going back to the very first papers and writing them up in a language called Faust, which is very high level. Not only that, also the C++, the synthesis toolkit. And so I'm working on reference implementations, patches that are represent my best understanding of how to do things in these various research areas. And it's a nice exercise because it tests the theory. I think this really will simulate a piano, but let's just go ahead and do it, and then put it out there as a reference pad. It also makes it easier for composers to use it. The thing about Faust is that it can be compiled into a VST plugin or a LADSPA plugin or a PD patch or a super collider patch or just plain C++. You can write your own architecture file and it will adapt to any environment you like. You just have to implement drivers, so to speak, for the various virtual controls. It has GUIs built in, GUI specification built in, and you specify the mathematical translation from the GUI to your algorithm, and it's all very compact, very clean. And so I'm having a lot of fun just implementing things. That may be my last stage. I may just be doing that for the rest of my life. So tune in and try them out, and hopefully people will use it more. I think people haven't been doing enough of what can be done, and so I don't know why that is, but maybe they're just not interested. But I'm going to make it really easy to do it if there's interest. That's my goal. I have 1 quarter sabbatical. I'm going to have some nice electric guitars and a new wah pedal, and so if you want Whalen electric guitars with howling feedback and distortion, some real string model-based guitars. They'll be ready by January 7th because that's when my sabbatical quarter ends, and by definition they'll be done. And so check my website and download your Planet Karma distribution, and it'll all just work. I mean, it sounds pretty good to me now, but you have to tell me what you think.
At the risk of sitting too close, one thing I'd like to point out about my friend to the right here is that Julius has one of the most incredible web presences of anybody I know, in the sense that you can get a lot of the material and the kinds of things that he's talking about, from looking at web pages that he makes available to the rest of us, which is very much appreciated by everybody in the field. And I recommend that if you haven't looked at it, you owe yourself a good time some evening just going through and finding out what's there, because if you get hooked, you'll be there for a lot longer than one evening, believe me. As far as my, that's just a little advertisement.
Thank you. That's my 4 books. They're all online. They're free, and they're automatically interlinked. So there's this sort of, Xanadu
hyperlinks from book to book and all that.
Yeah, I'm still working on that.
It's disgusting.
Anyway, it doesn't quite work right either, but I'm working. Yeah, it's going to get better. The auto links are hard to do. It's hard to do automatic linking really well. I need a computer science expert to tell me how to really do that. It works 90-something% of the time.
What's that website?
Just do a Google search for Julius Smith, and you'll be there. Or music signal processing. There are a lot of ways to get to it.
Okay.
It's 4 books online, interlinked, 2,000 pages if you print it all out. That was phase 3.
Don't start with that.
So, yeah, you don't have to do that until you're in your 40s. Write up everything like that.
I have 2 pet projects. One's a research project and one's a development project. The development project that I'm working on right now is something that is might sound a bit odd, but maybe not. I'm using computer music techniques and technology to develop a treatment for a medical condition called tinnitus. Tinnitus is something that if you have experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't experienced it, congratulations. I hope it stays that way for you. But tinnitus is the ringing in the ears that doesn't stop. And it's something that is an occupational hazard for musicians, particularly ones in the electroacoustic field, but certainly not limited to them. And if you look at such things as how music and hearing go together, you find out that it really is true that violinists don't hear so well in their left ear, flutists don't hear so well in their right ear, percussionists can't hear at all. And you know, there are, of course, lots of connections between our ability to hear, which affect us more and more as time goes by. So this is something that I've been quite surprised to learn can be addressed through using some of the sound synthesis techniques that we've worked out in the context of computer music, and it's a surprising application that I'm developing right now. My research interest is primarily in the area of quantum physics, because I think that quantum physics is intimately related to the future, not only of our understanding of one of the great things we're about to figure out in the next 20 years, not even 40, I hope, which is understanding the human mind and consciousness better. And it's also very much related to the future of computing. That is, the prospects for using quantum techniques as a basis for computing and completely changing our understanding of what computing even means is something that I think is profound, and it's being worked out in a theoretical way right now. We don't have practical quantum computers to go program at this point, but many, many people are working on providing precisely that. And so I don't think this much effort is going to lead to no results within the next 20 years. I think within 20 years or so we'll be computing in ways that we haven't even begun to imagine at this point. So I'm looking into quantum signal processing and other things that are relatable to computer music in a quantum world.
Maureen,
How about you, John?
Yes.
Yes.
what do I do?
No,
Hey, John,
Pet project.
you answer the
stop
question.
passing the buck.
The moderators.
Well, unlike the people here, I compose music, and that's all I do. I mean, they do too, but I don't involve myself much with technology. I guess what I do the most these days is to listen to the work of young composers and to criticize their work, to encourage them, because I've discovered that that's something that very few people do, and that many young composers are very hungry for the comments of someone who's done this all their life and would like to know where they are in their development, and so that's what I do.
Well, my pet project has been, for the last several years, working with Max's radio baton. And recently I've had more access to it. And I plan to be using it in the studio. You know, I've thought now and then that really my students don't pay me for the voice lesson as much as they pay me not to play piano. So having the radio baton allows me to pre-program some actual accompaniments for students, and I'm very interested in this physical coordination which a singer has to have. It's not very obvious. A lot of the time when they're singing, they make it look so easy that they're just thinking and the sound falls out, but actually you have to be very physically coordinated. Another area that I'm interested in is the learning aspect, because when you're using Max's baton, you actually have control over the tempo, and you can play with rubato, and you can play with a tenuto, a hold, and then quickly you pretty much understand, well, why am I doing this? And, oh, well, the hold doesn't need to be that long, or rather, you know, why am I doing it here rather than there? Why am I slowing it down or making it louder or softer? And I think these are, I've come to appreciate more what conductors actually do in the process of doing accompaniments for myself as well. So I'm interested in seeing the natural reflexes that students may or may not have, and to sort of chart that and find out what the norm is.
Well, I've gotten hooked on this a question of what kinds of timbres can you make using a lot of simple but dynamically tunable resonant filters. Now, what do I mean by a resonant filter? Well, technically this is, to me, a two-pole filter that has one peak in it, and it can be a very prominent peak. And I think that almost all musical instruments have lots of resonances in them, and that the physical model of the instrument causes these resonances to interact in different ways. The simplest way is just a bunch of filters that are all stimulated by something, and then you add up their outputs, parallel connections of the filters. But there are instruments like the human voice that this is not true in. The vocal tract is usually simulated by a sequence of resonances, where the output of the first one is the input to the second, and so forth, a series connection of resonant filters. And you can, of course, have parallel series connections and all sorts of complex collections. And these are all described by their poles and zeros. And nowadays, we can make difference equations so that you can have dynamically tunable poles and zeros, i.e., you can move the pole around in its frequency and in its damping, and use the time function of these frequencies as a musical parameter, a compositional parameter, perhaps. So anyhow, I've made a little timbre workshop program where it's easy to interconnect a large number of filters. And by large number, I mean anywhere from 100 to 1,000, because the computer is powerful enough to deal with this kind of numbers, and see what the timbral responses of these things are like.
John?
Well, I am at the moment focused upon engaging virtuosic performers with this medium about which we have spoken. Virtuosity is tied to repertoire. Without a rich repertoire, we would not have virtuoso performance. I don't mean by repertoire simply printed music or published music, but that also means rich traditions as in improvised music, whether it's in our culture like jazz or in other cultures where it's an oral tradition, but there's a rich model against which one makes judgments about one's performance, and that leads to virtuosity. And for me, there's nothing as exciting as hearing a really fine performer perform music that is new and engaging. And I like being part of that process, which is now so easily achieved. So I wrote a piece for Maureen, who is a very skilled performer with a wonderful ear that is interactive, the first piece I've been able to do of that sort. And I want to continue doing that, trying to build the kinds of music structures that we were used to in the old days of Music 5, Music 4, where one prepared everything, with the idea of improvisation or contingencies based upon what's happening at the current instant, all of which is readily doable with programs like PD or Max MSP. And so my interests extend then from the voice to other instruments, to perhaps many, many instruments in the future. But I find it very rich and challenging and musically satisfying.
Well, this brings us to
There's
the
a-
end. One brief question. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was actually wondering whether all of you agree with the observation about the death of the concert hall. You've talked a great deal about the production of music, but not so much revolutions in the reception of music, and you know how that spatial component of music can be transformed.
People are working on it. Spatial audio is now in the MPEG standard, and we're going to have speaker arrays in our home and spatialized sound, adaptive speaker arrays that optimize for the geometry. It's going to be great, but it's taking a long time. I don't know why it's taking so long. The technology's there. We just have to get it out, standardize it.
Yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
I agree with what you're saying.
It's on the way. Help is on the way. I like those earphones, those reference earphones you can buy now. They call them reference earphones. So they're really well calibrated signals delivered right to your ear canal. I do all my listening in earphones these days. I mean, fundamentally, that should be the right signal. Even that's hard to get right, but.
Well, I'll miss the communal function.
Yeah, the real hall. Mm-hmm.
No,
Well-
it'll continue to be there
Yeah.
with all of its warts.
Right.
The concert
Except for
hall,
the agoraphobic.
the
Yeah.
concert hall is a place where people congregate, so it's a social event. And for me, that's often very important. Like watching a movie at home is not the same experience as watching one in the theater, where it's a shared experience, where we all laugh together or we all cry together. And so at a concert hall, independent of the particular acoustics of a particular place, and I agree with Max, we hear better in optimal conditions in our homes these days, but there's something about being with people at an event. Like, I will never forget hearing von Karajan conduct the Ninth Symphony at the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, and it was an experience which was such an incredible event because of the tensions, both cultural, and this was only like 8 years after the Second World War or something, and so von Karajan coming to Paris and doing this German music, it was tense, it was a degree of perfection that was unforgettable, and the whole audience knew it. And so that's a shared experience that I hope we don't give up entirely. I doubt that we will. Theaters thrive.
All right, well, I want to thank Tulane for hosting us, and I want to thank my fellow panelists here for donating their time and coming all this way to present their thoughts about both the past and the future. Thank you all for coming.